Welcome to Democracy Talk, the short interview series for the forthcoming Virtual Global Roundtable, organised by the International Association of Constitutional Law, on Democracy 2020, assessing constitutional decay, breakdown and renewal worldwide. It's happening on the 18th to the 26th of November, 9 webinars across 5 days. Now, I was delighted to sit down on the 9th of November with Ugochukwu Ezeh, who's going to be speaking in webinar 4 on the 19th of November on unpacking the role of courts in electoral processes. Ugo is a lecturer in the Faculty of Law at the University of Lagos. Ugo, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Professor Daly.
Please call me Tom. So, Ugo, we've been hearing a lot about contested elections and courts in the US context in the last few days and weeks, but you're working on this issue in the African context. So I'm really interested to hear, first of all, question 1. In webinar 4, you're going to be talking about courts as a remedy against electoral malpractices and broader patterns of arrested democratization, especially the phenomenon of what you call African presidential election petitions, PEPs. So can you explain quickly how common this phenomenon is?
So thank you very much for that question. I would say that the phenomenon of judicialization of electoral politics on the continent is not necessarily a recent one. In quite a number of jurisdictions where efforts have been made to consolidate democratic forms of government, sadly, we've seen a general state of dissatisfaction with the electoral process, certainly with the performance of some of the electoral management bodies as well. And so the absence of credible elections has been a serious matter of concern. So in some cases, we've seen a general lack of a level playing field between incumbent presidents and opposition groups. We've seen some cases of vote buying, some cases of vote rigging, voter intimidation as well. There have been concerns about the fact that some incumbents and other state functionaries enjoy a disproportionate access to state media resources in circumstances that afford them an unfair advantage in electoral contests. In some other jurisdictions as well, we've seen a disturbing phenomenon in which there's been an increasing militarization of some electoral contests. And so in response to these patterns of democratic decline and arrested democratization, if you like, some courts, some litigants, some political and constitutional actors have sought to mobilize judicial power as a remedial mechanism.
Thanks, Ugo. And so you undertake a comparative analysis of presidential election petitions from Kenya and Malawi on the one hand, in which assertive courts invalidated flawed presidential election results, and then Zimbabwe and Nigeria on the other hand, where similarly flawed results were upheld. So can you tell us a little bit more about the Kenyan and the Malawian contexts first?
So thank you. In the Kenyan case, the Kenyan Supreme Court made a historic and an assertive intervention in the Kenyan political process in terms of the August 2017 presidential elections. The majority decision of the court found that the presidential election had not been conducted substantially in accordance with constitutional principles and other statutory frameworks governing the conduct of elections in Kenya. And so the court invalidated the elections and ordered a fresh election. The court interestingly framed the issues in terms of its constitutional obligation to ensure that the democratic will of the Kenyan people was not subverted and frustrated through the conduct of elections that violated the principles guiding elections in the Kenyan 2010 constitution. It was a groundbreaking decision, and it represents a very foundational moment, I would say, in the African electoral jurisprudence. Now, this example of the Kenyan court was followed recently, actually earlier this year, by the Malawian courts. First, the Malawian Constitutional Court and the Malawian Supreme Court of Appeal, they invalidated contested presidential elections in Malawi and ordered fresh presidential elections as well. One interesting aspect of those decisions was the emphasis the court placed on the importance of a credible electoral process. The court urged its audience, if you like, to conceptualize elections not as events, but as processes. And as such, the integrity and the credibility of the electoral process is a matter of paramount importance. So these are very interesting developments in comparative law and certainly in the African electoral jurisprudence as well.
Absolutely groundbreaking and deserve to be so widely known. So what's really interesting then is you get these similarly flawed sort of election results in Zimbabwe and Nigeria, but you get a different result with a different approach by the court. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, the Nigerian and Zimbabwean cases are perhaps open to criticism in that they tended to depart from the progressive adjudicatory approaches adopted earlier on in the African electoral jurisprudence. Of course, a good example would be the Kenyan case. So in some cases, courts, when presented with evidence of electoral malpractices and electoral irregularities, have nonetheless justified their decisions to uphold impugned elections on the grounds that those malpractices and irregularities did not substantially affect the electoral results. Now, whilst some of these decisions may be defensible on grounds of public policy, it's also possible to argue that these adjudicatory positions do not sufficiently address serious concerns about the credibility of the electoral process in those countries. And as the Malawian Supreme Court of Appeal recently pointed out, it is difficult to isolate the numerical results of an electoral contest from the broader issue of the credibility and integrity of the electoral process itself. And so it might have been better for courts in those jurisdictions to foreground that particular issue. But having said that, it's also important to acknowledge that those decisions may also be rationalized on the basis of their particular facts and on the basis of the particular context in which they were decided. So in some cases, the evidence presented to the courts is unsatisfactory. In some cases, we've seen opposition groups that are so fragmented and disorganized that they are unable to substantiate their claims in court. And then again, it's important to also acknowledge that in some cases, the political context is one that does not favor an intrepid exercise of judicial independence. So again, Nigeria and Zimbabwe are very good examples of jurisdictions where we've seen substantial political interference with courts in recent times. So those are probably the angles through which I would approach the issues.
So context and facilitating conditions are extremely important. And you argue that the Kenyan and the Malawian approach is preferable on the basis that it can potentially support democratization and democratic renewal. So I'm interested to know, why do you take that position as a normative position?
Well, I would like to enter a caveat. I do not think that courts can unilaterally rescue democracy. And I think, of course, my views also resonate with yours. You have extensively addressed these issues in your own work. I believe that courts, when they act in concert with other pro-democracy actors, can make meaningful contributions nonetheless towards the cause of democratic renewal, towards democratic consolidation in these transitional societies. But what I most admired about the Kenyan and the Malawian approaches was the extent to which the courts there foregrounded the issue of the credibility and the integrity of the electoral process. The courts were very particular about ensuring that elections are looked at as a process and that we do not fixate on the numerical results of those contests. As the Malawian Supreme Court of Appeal put it, when you fixate on the results of an election, there's no way to tell if those results were themselves procured or produced by vote rigging or corruption or voter intimidation or other forms of electoral malpractice. So it's important to return to the foundational issue, which is the electoral process credible? is it a process that has produced an election that accords with global, if you like, best practices in terms of the conduct of elections? So that's what I most admired about those decisions.
Thank you so much. So you and I are pretty much in agreement then that can be very important, but they can't do everything. So this has been absolutely fascinating for me, Ugo, being a court and democracy obsessive myself. And I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion in webinar 4 on the 19th of November. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, for having me. It's a pleasure.